There's a moment every man remembers, even if he tries to forget it. Not the moment she walked away, not the moment the story collapsed, but the quieter, stranger moment when something under your life shifted, like a fault line slipping in the dark. Betrayal rarely arrives as an earthquake. It begins as a subtle fracture that runs silently beneath two lives. Yours in a way you can feel, theirs in a way they work tirelessly not to feel. And yet this is the part almost no man names. The night you felt yourself break was also the night something in them began to collapse from the inside out. Most men misinterpret this moment. They assume the visible collapse, the sleepless nights, the loss of appetite, the self-interrogation, is proof of their own inadequacy. Meanwhile, the betrayer seems to ascend. New faces, new connections, new declarations of freedom that look like confidence and land in your nervous system as confirmation that you were the problem all along. But that's a misunderstanding born from pain, not from truth. What looks like their ascent is often a frantic attempt to outrun a fracture that started the moment they severed the very bond regulating their inner world. If you've been here, you know the sensation. Identity folding in on itself, replaying memories to see where you failed, your body rushing with a level of activation that makes simple tasks feel insurmountable. It feels like your psyche is being interrogated under a harsh light, and yet, beneath their polished posts and sudden reinvention, something entirely different is happening. Their betrayal wasn't a masterstroke of self-liberation. It was an act of psychic self-sabotage, the equivalent of a commander torching his own supply routes, because acknowledging a strategic flaw feels more dangerous than losing the war. Most men don't see this because they've been conditioned to believe that pain equals failure. But in Jungian terms, you're confronting your shadow, the part of you that carries old wounds, unspoken fears, internalized stories about worth. Betrayal forces this confrontation. It breaks the illusion that you can negotiate with your abandonment wounds through loyalty alone. Meanwhile, the one who betrayed you doesn't face their shadow. They outsource it. They cast it into you, into the relationship, into anyone who mirrors back an uncomfortable truth. And betrayal, ironically, is the shattering of the very mirror they depend on to maintain their identity. Neuroscience offers a quiet confirmation. When betrayal hits, your system goes into hyperactivation. Cortisol spikes, vigilance rises. The body searches for safety that is no longer available. Theirs. It often moves toward numbing, a cycle of compulsive validation, rapid replacement, or emotional anesthesia that keeps the deeper wound out of awareness. One nervous system is overwhelmed. The other is shutting down. Neither state is strength, but one of them leads somewhere. The other becomes a long defeat stretched across years. If you've been telling yourself, "This proves she was happier without me," notice the assumption underneath it, that your pain is evidence of your deficiency. But pain is not a verdict. Pain is proof that you invested, that you cared, that your psyche is recalibrating around a rupture it didn't choose. And the deeper revelation here, the one men almost never recognize, is that their act didn't reveal your inadequacy. It revealed their structural fragility. Before we move on, one quiet reframe to sit with. You are not broken for having felt this deeply. You are awake. And if you want to stay with me, when we reach the midpoint of this video, I'll name the single pattern men almost never catch about narcissistic betrayal. One shift that changes the entire narrative of what actually collapsed that day. For now, let the image settle. One fault line, two lives, two very different consequences. If you're ready, we move next into the anatomy of that fracture, and why what looked like their upgrade was really the beginning of their slow internal decline. There's a moment after betrayal when the mind insists on an old, familiar interpretation. She upgraded. It arrives like a sharp whisper in the dark, not because it is true, but because you are standing inside a wound, and your nervous system is searching for an explanation that will stop the bleeding. Yet what appears as an upgrade is almost always something else entirely. It is flight from exposure. When your presence begins to reveal the cracks in someone's carefully constructed self-image, they do what they have always done to survive. They run from the mirror. In mythic terms, they resemble a paper monarch, banishing the one advisor who sees the throne beginning to sag under its own ornamented weight. And beneath that impulse sits a deeper wound, one often rooted in early humiliation or emotional neglect. For someone who never learned to metabolize accountability without feeling small, being confronted with truth feels like shrinkage. Boundaries feel like insults. Authenticity feels like threat. Your ability to perceive the subtle inconsistencies in their behavior becomes intolerable, not because you were wrong, but because you were too accurate. Leaving isn't liberation, it is escape. As we move into what looks like their reinvention, it becomes clearer why betrayals repeat. Narcissistic supply is not affection. It is oxygen, a source of emotional regulation they siphon from others without the capacity to internalize it. When they cut you off, they sever a predictable source of stabilization that they had come to rely on, even if they mocked or minimized it. This is why the aftermath so often includes an immediate scramble for attention, admiration, or replacement intimacy. The psyche takes a blunt hit when it loses someone who knows its inner wiring, its inconsistencies, its hidden shame, its carefully guarded stories. Supply wasn't just comfort, it was continuity. And here lies a reframe many men overlook. Your loss is personal, painful, intimate. Theirs is structural. You lose a partner, a shared history, a future you invested in. They lose a vault of secrets, a regulator of their emotional turbulence, and a witness who anchored their identity. This is not sentiment, it is architecture. Every betrayal forces them into an identity reboot. New narratives, new personas, new mythologies that protect the fragile scaffolding of selfhood from collapsing. And each reboot corrodes their sense of who they are. Jung would say that every discarded bond is another missed opportunity to meet their own shadow, another fracture in the bridge they would need to walk if they ever wanted to become whole. Signs of this collapse appear early, though they rarely recognize them. There is the frantic self-curation online, the constant comparison rituals, the oscillation between superiority and martyrdom. There is the cycle with new partners that mirrors the one they had with you. Rapid idealization, covert disappointment, subtle punishing, emotional instability. Survivors often report that chaos begins to spill into other arenas of the betrayer's life, friendships, work, community, until blame becomes the primary tool for maintaining the illusion of innocence. These are not random anomalies. They are the internal tremors of a psyche folding inward on itself. Meanwhile, your pain, though acute, overwhelming, and at times disorienting, has a different trajectory. Pain metabolized becomes clarity. Pain felt consciously becomes self-respect. Pain understood becomes the first step toward individuation, but their path is one of compounding consequence, slowly accumulating in the dark. They do not escape the collapse, they postpone it. Before we move forward, one quiet line to hold. What feels like the end of your story is often the beginning of theirs, not because of karma or cosmic punishment, but because the nervous system cannot outrun itself. What they sever externally begins eroding them internally. If you choose to continue, the next section will take us into the biology of what your nervous system endured and why their wiring makes genuine attachment almost impossible. This clarity often becomes the turning point where men finally stop mistaking their own pain for proof of inadequacy. There's a moment in the aftermath of betrayal when you look at yourself and wonder why you're the one falling apart, while they seem strangely intact. That contrast can feel humiliating, as if your depth is a liability and their detachment is a kind of strength. But the truth is far more human and far less flattering to the story you've been telling yourself. Two bodies lived the same event, but each carried an entirely different map of love, fear, and attachment. One nervous system shatters because it was built for connection. The other turns to stone because connection has always been too costly to feel. Trauma bonding is often misunderstood as naivety or weakness. It's not. It is the psychological effect of alternating idealization and deprivation. Your system was taught to attach through a rhythm of hope and fear, tenderness and distance, promises and ruptures. Over time, this rhythm fuses into a kind of addiction, not to the person, but to the intermittent reward. Each brief moment of affection spiked dopamine and oxytocin, and each sudden withdrawal flooded your body with cortisol. The nervous system began misinterpreting chaos as connection, unpredictability as intimacy. Meanwhile, the person who created this pattern was living in an entirely different emotional reality. For them, the relationship was not a shared story unfolding between two equal hearts. It was functional. It provided admiration, stability, status, or emotional oxygen. Once the usefulness of the bond dropped, once the supply became too familiar, too discerning, or too boundary-oriented, the calculus shifted. Discard, in that sense, is not cruelty in their world, it is efficiency. And their rapid recovery, the part that feels like a knife in your side, is often dissociation masquerading as strength. They do not breathe deeply into loss because they never breathed deeply into love. A useful metaphor here is the casino. Addiction is not created by winning, but by not knowing when the next win might come. Your heart was trained to stay at a table that never intended to pay out. Every rare moment of tenderness became a jackpot light, a moment so bright it erased hours or days of emotional depletion. You weren't foolish. You were conditioned. And while you kept showing up to a court you believed was worth serving, you didn't realize the rules had been built to keep you loyal without ever letting you feel secure. There comes a moment in every man's healing when he asks the question beneath all the other questions. Why wasn't I enough? But that is the wrong question. A more honest one is, who taught my nervous system that vigilance was love? And the answer usually traces back to early environments where affection was inconsistent, where you learned to work for warmth, where you believed that if you held on long enough, someone would finally choose you in the way you had been choosing them. This is not weakness, it is history. And yet, here is an anchor worth holding. Their betrayal does not evaluate your worth. It reveals their limits. While you built a coherent internal narrative of love, partnership, and shared meaning, they experienced the relationship as a temporary structure scaffolding their identity. When the structure no longer upheld their preferred self-image, its collapse was inevitable. Not because you lacked value, but because they lacked the internal architecture to meet the emotional reality you were offering. As we move forward, let this thought settle. The gravity you felt was real. The attachment you formed was real. But the bond was asymmetrical in a way your body sensed long before your mind could name it. The next chapter widens the lens and asks a different question. What happens to someone who repeats this pattern across every relationship they touch? When their coping strategies become their destiny, the story begins to look very different. There is a moment in the healing process when the story begins to turn. Not because you are forcing clarity, but because enough time has passed for patterns to reveal themselves. And when you look closely at the arc of a narcissistic betrayal, you begin to see something that was invisible in the beginning. The loop they reenact is not new. It is a script written long before you arrived, and long before the partners before you arrived. Idealization, exploitation, betrayal, discard, the same sequence, the same rhythm, the same emotional mathematics. In each cycle, they cast themselves as either the misunderstood savior or the unfairly persecuted victim. The pattern protects them from one unbearable truth, that the wound driving their behavior lives inside, not outside. Every time the cycle resets, the narrative must be rewritten to keep that truth buried. This is why they can move from relationship to relationship with such certainty, and yet leave behind a trail of ruptures, unfinished conflicts, and unresolved stories. Each betrayal requires a new justification, a new set of revisions that turn their actions into necessity rather than consequence. Over time, the psychological distance between who they are and who they believe themselves to be widens. The shadow grows heavier, and the cost of carrying it increases, even if they never name it. One of the quiet revelations men discover, often months or years after the separation, is that life has its own way of collecting what the psyche refuses to integrate. Across countless survivor accounts, a similar image emerges. The ex-partner cycling through unstable relationships, estranged from their own children, embroiled in micro-conflicts at work, or constantly repairing a reputation that keeps slipping through their fingers. And yet, even within this, they cling to the belief that they are the one being wronged, that the universe has conspired against them, that their suffering has been inflicted, not created. This isn't karma in the mystical sense. It is the psychology of shadow avoidance. When someone refuses to meet the parts of themselves that are causing harm, those parts begin sculpting their outer life instead. On your side of the equation, the impact is different. Betrayal trauma doesn't simply hurt, it rewires. Trust, identity, relational safety, each one is shaken. Clinicians describe how men often struggle with boundaries after such an experience, not because they are weak, but because their internal compass has been scrambled by a rupture they were not prepared for. Meanwhile, the person who caused the trauma avoids moral responsibility by exporting blame. They detach from regret because regret requires integration, and integration threatens the fragile persona they depend on. What looks like apathy is often defense. What looks like confidence is often scaffolding. And there is another layer, one that becomes clearer with distance. Over time, consequences begin to gather around them, not as lightning strikes, but as accumulated stories. Colleagues who no longer extend trust, friends who step back quietly, a steady decline in credibility. Patterns that once occurred once a year begin occurring twice a year, then monthly. Their public mask starts to fracture as their private patterns become too visible for others to ignore. Yet even then, the narrative protects them. The world is unfair, people are jealous, circumstances are hostile. Persecution becomes an identity because accountability feels like annihilation. Here, a single sentence often shifts something in a man's understanding. Their world shrinks, but not because of justice, because of repetition. And the cycle only breaks when someone steps out of the role assigned to them. Which brings us back to you. The turning point is not when they collapse. It is when you withdraw your participation in the script, when you stop carrying the shadow they will not face. When you step out of the emotional choreography they have rehearsed for years. Their life continues shrinking, but your life begins expanding, not through revenge, but through clarity. Ahead, the terrain changes. We move into the space where your silence becomes something they cannot manipulate, and where your absence begins to reveal what your presence once held together. The midpoint is behind us. The descent into their unraveling, and your emergence, begins from here. There is a phase after the midpoint of healing where something unexpected happens. You stop watching them, but the impulse to check still flickers at the edges of your awareness. It shows up as a sudden urge to revisit old conversations, a tightening in the chest when a mutual friend posts something vague, a moment of wondering who they are with now or how quickly they seem to have rebuilt their world. Many men misinterpret this as longing, but it's often something more ancient, the residue of hypervigilance learned in childhood, where you monitored unpredictability to feel safe. The mind calls it curiosity. The body calls it a tether. This tether is subtle. It disguises itself as a desire for closure, fairness, proof, or understanding. But beneath all that, attention is still a form of emotional supply. Even in absence, the connection lives inside your nervous system, replaying itself the way a dream can replay long after you've woken. You may feel ashamed for still checking in on them internally, yet that shame is misplaced. Your system is not malfunctioning. It is unwinding from a pattern that trained you to anticipate emotional storms as a way of preventing pain. Letting this be true without judgment is often the beginning of release. And here is where the dynamic begins to shift in ways they never expected. When you withdraw your emotional participation, when your reactions stop feeding their sense of control, their entire ecosystem becomes destabilized. Many of their familiar strategies lose traction. Guilt no longer pulls you back. Pity no longer reopens the door. Triangulation loses its shine. The cycle that once worked with precision now malfunctions, not because they have changed, but because you have stopped playing the role they assigned you. It is often in this phase that their search for replacement supply intensifies. They are not seeking love, they are seeking regulation. In Jungian language, you once held a piece of their shadow for them. You carried their unmet needs, their unacknowledged shame, their split-off self-doubt. You absorbed it in arguments, reconciliations, silence, or caretaking. When you step out of that role, the shadow returns to its owner, and the psyche, when confronted with what it has avoided, often enters a phase of panic. Not necessarily visible panic, but internal fragmentation, an erosion of the narratives that once held everything together. Around this point, some men begin to notice something subtle in themselves, a restlessness that isn't quite anxiety, but isn't yet freedom. That space between the two is where transformation begins. One quiet experiment some men explore is giving themselves 24 hours where they do not revisit the story. Not as punishment, not as discipline, but as a way of observing what surfaces when the tether loosens. In those hours, panic may arise, Emptiness may arise. There may be a flicker of longing or a wave of anger. All of it is data. All of it shows where the gravitational pull still lives in the body. And the more gently it is observed, the more honestly the pattern begins to unravel. From their side, your withdrawal does something they never anticipate. Betrayal is engineered to place you in pursuit. It assumes your pain will orbit them. When you step out of that orbit, their sense of indispensability begins to crack. It's not dramatic. It's not cinematic. It's quiet. Yet it destabilizes the identity they constructed from your reactions. Your silence becomes a mirror they cannot manipulate, a surface that reflects nothing back to them. In that nothingness, their carefully curated persona begins to lose definition. And here is the line that often marks the beginning of a man's emotional sovereignty. Your quiet exit removes the scaffolding that once held their illusion together. Without your presence regulating their inner chaos, their narrative starts to buckle under its own weight. Not because you intended harm, but because truth has a way of revealing what performance once concealed. As we move toward the next phase, a larger question begins to take shape. What happens to someone whose entire relational strategy depends on people they cannot keep? The next chapter steps into that terrain, the existential cost of a life built on performance rather than connection. And from there, the architecture of their long-term decline becomes unmistakably clear. When we reach this point in the story, something becomes unmistakably clear. Betrayal was never an isolated act. It was a symptom of a deeper architecture, one that cannot sustain intimacy without eventually destroying the very connection it depends on. By now, your silence has exposed the edges of that architecture, and we can finally see what it costs them over time. Not in moments of drama, but in the slow erosion of a life built on performance. Picture the archetype of a ruler in an echoing fortress. The walls are tall, the halls are filled with admirers, and yet the rooms remain strangely cold. This is the hollow king archetype, surrounded but untouched, admired but untruly known. Each betrayal deepens the moat around this fortress. Every severed bond becomes another layer of emotional distance that makes intimacy feel more dangerous and more impossible. And here is the truth they rarely admit, even to themselves. The very thing they crave, being seen, being chosen, being valued, is the thing their defenses prevent them from receiving. The shadow they punish in others is the shadow they refuse to acknowledge within. There is also a long arc that trauma draws across personality. Neuroscience shows that unprocessed experiences tighten the psyche. Defenses harden, identity narrows, adaptability weakens. When someone organizes their entire emotional world around avoiding shame, every interaction becomes a potential threat. They are not participating in reality. They are editing it. They are not relating. They are maintaining a persona. And the longer this continues, the more the false self becomes the only self they can tolerate. Betrayal is simply the most dramatic expression of that internal rigidity. Over time, something begins to happen that is easy to miss if you only look at the immediate aftermath. For many people with these patterns, life becomes smaller, not suddenly, not catastrophically, but incrementally. Relationships become shorter, friendships become strained, family ties become frayed. There is a quiet fatigue that begins to settle in the people around them. The narratives they tell grow increasingly contradictory because every severed bond must be rewritten into a story where they remain the hero or the victim. Yet these stories accumulate like bricks, each one sealing them deeper inside themselves. The fortress grows, but so does the emptiness inside it. And beneath it all sits a fear powerful enough to shape an entire life. The core terror is not loneliness. It is being truly seen and subsequently dismissed. It is the fear that if someone glimpsed the unguarded self beneath the persona, they would walk away. Betrayal, then, becomes a form of preemptive abandonment. It says, without words, I will reject you before you have the chance to reject me. But this strategy, meant to protect them, ensures that the very outcome they fear becomes the landscape they must live in. The moat widens, the halls grow quieter, the applause becomes thin. As this unfolds on their side, another truth emerges on yours. The further you walk from the collapse, the more you begin to see that betrayal did not end your story. It exposed its next threshold. The question now shifts from why they did what they did to what this rupture is asking of you. Because a man who was betrayed but is no longer entangled stands in a very different position than he once did. He stands at the threshold of individuation, the point where the old pattern can dissolve and a new one can be chosen. Before we move into the final chapter, consider this. What collapses in them is often the very thing that frees you, not through vengeance, not through righteousness, but through alignment. In the conclusion, we assemble the full architecture of their undoing and trace the path that leads you back to yourself, where your story begins again with a different center of gravity. As we arrive at the final movement of this story, it becomes clear that the moment of betrayal was never just about the rupture you felt. It was also the moment their hidden fracture began to reveal itself. The contrast between your visible collapse and their apparent composure was never a sign of strength in them or deficiency in you. It was simply the difference between a man who feels deeply enough to integrate pain and a person who has spent a lifetime avoiding their own inner world. What you experienced as an earthquake was, for them, the cracking of a fault line that had been running beneath their life long before you entered it. When we step back and trace the arc, the psychology becomes impossible to ignore. Each betrayal deepened their dependency on illusion. Each severed bond required more narrative editing, more internal distortion, more distance from the truth of who they are. Meanwhile, the same moment forced you into an uncompromising encounter with your shadow, your wounds, your longings, your hopes, your patterns, your unexamined loyalty. Pain, in your case, became a doorway. In theirs, avoidance became a prison. What broke you open began breaking them apart. This is not cosmic justice, nor is it punishment. It is simply the nature of unintegrated patterns. A person who betrays repeatedly does not suffer because the universe is balancing a scale. They suffer because they continue living inside the architecture that creates the betrayal in the first place. Isolation is not a consequence imposed from outside. It is the natural result of a psyche that cannot hold intimacy without collapsing into shame or control. Over time, the fortress they build to protect themselves becomes the very structure that prevents them from receiving what they claim to desire. The moat grows deeper, the walls grow higher, and the quiet rooms inside echo louder each year. What this reveals on your side is equally important. You stand not as the discarded one, but as the one who now carries the data. You have seen the full pattern, the charm, the fracture, the chaos, the rewriting, the collapse. You have witnessed the cost of living behind a mask so tightly that authenticity becomes a threat. And because of this, you now hold the clarity they could not tolerate, the ability to regulate, to discern, to set boundaries, to rebuild from alignment rather than longing. These capacities grow in the aftermath of heartbreak, not in its absence. One of the quiet truths many men discover is that healing is less about becoming stronger and more about becoming clearer. Pain reorganizes the inner world. It exposes the stories that no longer serve. It reveals the values that matter. It sharpens intuition. It teaches the nervous system what chaos feels like, so it can recognize peace when it finally arrives. And perhaps most importantly, it shifts attention away from the one who left and back toward the one who remains, you. So as this chapter closes, the invitation is subtle but essential. Not to analyze them further, not to revisit the narrative, not to diagnose or blame, but to ask yourself a quieter, more honest question. What part of me is ready to rebuild with greater integrity than before? Because that is where their story ends, and that is where yours begins. If this traced your lived experience, and if there was a line in this story that reflected something you once felt but never articulated, you may choose to share it, just a sentence. It might be the line another man needs to recognize the pattern he is living inside.